Okay. So starting with materials, materials are basically the thing that we kind of like put on the surface of the mesh that determines how the mesh surface interacts with light. And so that creates the color, it creates other aspects of what we see on top of the mesh. And so right now, the materials we have are just basic materials. There's no real settings. And so we see the texture underneath, which is that blue grid, which is just an image that I generated. Let's actually take those off for a second. So let's go to our capsule, and I'm just going to, where did I put that? I'm gonna remove the materials here. So the default material is just this white color, and it's gonna multiply with the light and other things in the scene, ambient light and stuff like that. And so the material has a bunch of different properties, and we can go through a few. We don't have time to go over all of them, but we'll go through a few and see how it kind of changes the way the texture or the mesh looks. So what I want to do is make a material that affects both of these, and so I'm going to show you guys how to do that, and then we'll start playing around with it. So there's a few different ways to add a material. If I click on the mesh, there is a material slot right here, so I can add a material there. But there's also this surface material override, and that's useful for when you import an object that has a material already, which we'll look at in a little bit. I tend to use that one just because it's right there, so it's a little bit easier to access. So I can look at the material and the mesh as kind of different things. And then there's also this geometry instance. So the geometry instance is the base class that our mesh instance comes from. And so if we override the material there, we'll get the same result there. So I tend to use this surface material override, but you can use whatever you want. And if you just drag a material on, so I have these like default materials, if I just drag it on here, it's going to add it here to the geometry override. But let's use this surface material override. So if I create a material here, I just click on that empty, and if I want to create a new material inside of Godot, some materials come from other programs, and we'll look at that more when we look at textures. But in Godot, we can just choose a few different materials. So a standard material is what we're going to use most of the time. We're not really going to use shader materials, but I'll show you guys what that looks like. We're not really going to talk about shaders a lot, but shaders are basically the programs that actually determine all the math behind what's happening in the material. So if we made a shader material, what we would do is we could actually write a shader, some shader code in here. I don't, we're not going to go over that because it's a lot more details that we don't need to get into. If I need like something really specific when I'm working on one of my projects, I'll write my own shader. But it's, if you can avoid it, it's good. So we're not going to do that. So we're going to go with their standard material. And when we click on material, just like everything else, it opens up some more properties. What I want to do is I want this material to affect both of my objects. And so what I can do is save the material and then apply it to my box. So if I right click here, I can save as, and then I'll go back to my main folder and go to materials, and I'll call this new material, and just click save. And so now if I click on my box, I can go to my materials folder, and I can drag this in here. And so now I can add that material to as many different objects as I want to. And so when I make changes to the material on the capsule, we'll see those changes occur on the box at the same time. Okay, so let's look at a few things in here. So there's obviously a ton of parameters. We're not going to go over all these parameters, but I'll go over a couple. So in here, we can set transparency. So most of the time you don't really need transparency, but if you have like a texture that has transparent parts, you want to be able to see through parts of the mesh, then you need to turn that on. Same thing with lighting. Everything that we kind of like enable or add to our materials adds to the sort of burden of the processor as our scene is being rendered. So we're going to leave transparency off for now. In shading, this is where you can set a few different basic things. So the diffuse basically refers to the most textures use a diffuse algorithm to determine how the light spreads across the surface. So the light diffuses. Diffuse basically means to like spread. The default is the Burley. There's also a Lambert algorithm. I don't really know a ton about the differences between these, so we won't talk about it too much. You can see that it changes a little bit, but it's hard to really tell. One that's very obviously different is the toon shading. Toon shading is for non-realistic shaders, and it basically just doesn't use as much difference in our shading. Let's turn our lights down just a little bit because I think they're too bright. Okay. So you can see with the toon shader that we basically just get less data. There's less of a sort of blend between colors, and you just basically see a couple different colors on here. So those are kind of the main ones. There's a lot of other ones that are not available in Godot that you'll see if you use other programs, but those are the ones that we basically have in Godot. So then the next thing that we want to look at is the albedo. This is the main color, and usually we just set this as a color, but this is also where we would put our texture. So when we add textures later, we'll come back here. So if I change this color, we're going to change the main surface. So the color that we see ends up being the color that we add as the main color plus whatever lights are on here. So our pink light is very bright, so we get a lot of pink over here. On the back, we have this sort of gray that's more similar to our basic gray color. And then, any changes to the color that I make are going to affect this color of our shape, of our mesh. So yeah, that's the albedo. That's kind of the main color. If I make this black, it's going to be very dark. If I make it white, it'll be lighter. Make it a little bit of a light gray. So then there's some properties that determine how the material interacts with light. So metallic is the first one. You'll see if I turn this up, it changes how much light is reflected. Okay, so and the quality of the light is reflected. So it kind of like bands in the center there. It's not quite as bright. And then if I turn up the specular or turn it down, you get different types of highlights. You can add textures, so you can actually put textures into all these different properties and map how it looks like over, in different places. But that's a little bit more advanced than we need to get right now. So let's reset those. The roughness is basically how rough it is. So if it's 0, it's going to be really shiny, and that's when you start to see these like reflections that actually show us the lights. So that's if you have like a glass surface or a very like polished metal surface. And then the roughness and the metallic interact in a way. So if it's very rough, the light gets spread out in a more diffuse way. If it's not rough, if it's shiny, then we start to see these highlights. And then if we go back to our metallic, if it's more metallic, we get more color in the highlights and less color in the rest of the surface. If we turn up the specular, that just increases those highlights. So if we have 0 specular, we have 0 highlights. If we have full specular, we get those full highlights. So those are kind of the main basic properties that you can play around with. If you want, different types of textures that reflect the light, that have more metallic qualities or rough qualities. And again, this is going to depend on your surface as well. So if we look at this box, because the box doesn't have the smooth surface, the way that these are applied is just across this flat surface. So it changes depending on the geometry as well. Okay, so let's keep going. So we have emission. So this is actually if we want the object itself, the material itself, to glow, to emit light. And so if we turn this on and we change the emission color, we're going to see that it actually glows a little bit. And if we added some like post-processing effects and stuff like that, we would see you know, it kind of like glows in the scene. And if we let's put another object in here actually, to reflect some of that light. So I'll put another mesh, and let's put this over here. And for this one, let's do we could do a torus. Okay, so let's move this torus like here maybe. Actually, we can leave it here. It can be like a little life raft for our capsule. And if we go to our capsule, if I change the emission to something green or another color, and it's very bright, you'll see that that reflects on the torus. So it's actually, you know, emitting light out of our capsule. Let's put the torus in the middle, and we can see that. So you can see where the light is kind of affecting here at those intersections. So most of the time you probably won't use emission, but you can use it, and you can turn it up, and you're going to start to see that glow. You can also change, you know, how it does it, add or multiply. So there's some cool effects you can get with that. You can get like a little glowing effect there. But most of the time we'll have the emission off. Normal map we'll look at when we go to do some textures. Clear coat is like sort of some surfaces like skin and things like that. They absorb some light, but then they also have like a surface to them. So that's kind of what clear coat will sort of imitate. And so it's kind of hard to see here, but you can see it. There's this kind of like added sort of like surface diffusion that happens there. And then if you change the roughness, you're going to see more or less of that. So it's kind of subtle, but if you look at kind of the edge of this thing here, you can see where that clear coat is happening. So again, another thing that you probably might not need to use, but that exists there. So there's a bunch of other stuff like subsurface scattering. You can do a lot of other crazy stuff. But those are kind of like the main basic things that you'll probably use. Let's look at the shadows a little bit. Let's turn this around. We can also disable receive shadows. So you can see that the shadow is affecting the torus. But if we look at in the other direction, so we can see the shadow of the capsule affecting the torus, but I turned receive shadows on. If I turn that back off, now you see the shadow of the torus on the capsule. Okay, so we see that. It's hard to see. Let's go right there. So that's the torus shadow, and I can turn that on and off. Oops. Okay. Oh, what does that do? Shadow to opacity. I don't really know what that does. Okay, let's turn that off. So then most of the other stuff we will look at with textures. But yeah, that's kind of the basic idea of our materials. So let's pause for a second and we'll look at some textures and see how they work together. Any questions on the materials? Okay. So textures are basically images that we map onto our mesh, and that gives us color data, but it can also give us other types of data as well. So let's look at a couple examples. So what I want to do, I'm going to grab that pigeon model that I had before and give a couple examples with that. So let's put this guy in here. So the pigeon model came with its own material. So we can see that it's interacting with the light now that we have some lights in the scene. And with our pigeon model, if I go to editable children, you can see the material for the pigeon. So it's under this surface in here that's added with an imported mesh. And we can actually see the properties of this. We can see this is the texture that they used for it. And we can see the properties, but I can't change these properties. We can't edit this. We can override this. So if I really wanted to, for some reason, I could take this material that I just created and I could add that to my pigeon. But we don't want to get rid of the pigeon material. Most likely what we'd want to do is just edit it somewhere else. But if I want to add a new material overriding the pigeon, I can do that. But what we'll do in a second is look at that material in Blender and look at the texture there. You can create textures in Godot. So something that you might do is something like this. If I don't want to go and make a texture in another program, I can go to this, I can go to the albedo section here, and I can create a texture from Godot. So I could make, you can make an image texture, but then you have to put an image in there. But you can also make other textures. So for example, something that might be useful is like a noise texture. If I add in a noise texture, what we're gonna see is if I go on here and I add some noise, you can get some nice effects like that. Noise is basically just like randomness that's a little bit controlled. So instead of just being completely random, you see that there's this kind of like even smoothing between the dark and light parts of this texture. And so if you want a little bit of texture, but you don't want to go over to another program, you can add this in very easily. And then you can adjust this noise. So there's a few different options here. We might want to do like some cellular noise. You can change the frequency, which is like how much noise there is. So we can get something like that if we want just a little bit of texture, or we can increase it if we want a lot of texture. And if you spend a lot of time with this, you can get some interesting results. You can animate this, which might be a cool way to make some effects. But this is really just if you want to make something without going into another program. We can make this seamless, so it's not going to wrap around at any point. Although I don't really see, yeah, so you can see the seam here where the noise starts to wrap around. If I turn on seamless, then that goes away. We can also set it as a normal map if we want to. We'll go over normal maps in a minute. So that's one type of texture you can add within Godot. You can also add a gradient texture and other stuff, so you can play around with that stuff. And then this should interact with our main color as well. So if I change the color here, the white parts of the texture are going to interact with that color. And if I want, I can do a color ramp as well, which is going to be fun. So I can change how much of that noise kind of comes through by changing the color ramp. So the black is going to be, one side and the white is the other. And then I can change these colors as well. If I don't want this to be like fully black, I can, do something like that. So I can get some pretty cool effects just by playing around with some noise textures inside of Godot. But what most of the time you do is you make a texture in Blender or Photoshop or something like that and import it in. So let's go over to Blender for a second. I'll leave this here and look at our pigeon texture. And then we'll add in a couple more things. So let's go to Blender. And so we're just gonna look at creating a texture first from scratch, just so we can see what that process looks like. But we don't necessarily need to do that. If you're downloading models from other places, you can unpack those models and look at their textures and modify those. Yeah. Oh, okay. If you Google download Blender, you could download it and install it. I can type in the password to install it. All right, so let's create one from scratch real quick. So I'm gonna hit A and then X and delete everything in the scene. And then I'm just gonna hit Shift A and add a mesh. I'm gonna add the Suzanne monkey face, just to give us a little bit of geometry to look at. And so if I wanna add in a material and texture here, I'm gonna go to the, these little circles up here are the shading. So the default is just solid, so you don't actually see the material, you just see the mesh. Wireframe obviously is a wireframe, but what we want to use is the material preview. You could show the full shaded material, but I don't have any lights in the scene. I don't want to set all that up, so I'm just going to go with the material preview. So we see what the material will look like here. Now, if I want to edit my material, I can go over to UV editing. And so this is how you are going to create a texture in Blender. So you can see when we go over to the UV editing tab, you can see this is actually just the same thing, but it's switched into edit mode. And so when you're in edit mode in Blender, you can see the actual geometry here, and you can edit it if you want to. We're not going to do that, but you know, I could drag this around and make changes and do stuff in here, but we're not going to do that right now. But when I select all these vertices, you can see this is called the UV map. And a UV map basically takes the mesh and lays it out on a 2D surface so that we can add textures in to match where the mesh is going to be, and then the material will match those areas. So Blender has these default UVs for the meshes, but not everything has that. So for example, if this didn't have those default UVs, you might see something like this, or you know, you wouldn't see it, or you might see nothing at all. And what you want to do is you just select all of the vertices. So if they're not all selected, if it looks like that, just hit A to select all of them. I can double hit A to get rid of that, and then hit U to do UV mapping. And the easiest thing to do is just Smart UV Project. That makes something a little bit different. Since you know, we're using one of these defaults in Blender, we probably just want to stick with their default. But you could, this is going to map everything out, and you'll see if I select certain areas. So like if I unselect this and then I zoom into the eyeball, if I select on these these vertexes, you'll see where it's mapped these. And so it kind of threw them over here. That doesn't make that much sense. So we can stick with the typical Blender setup. Depending on where you get your model from, it will probably already have the UVs set up. But if it doesn't, then you can just do that U and then Smart UV Project. There's one setting here that might be useful, which is the island margin. If we turn this up, it's going to add a little bit of space in between the areas, like that. So that makes it a little easier to do the different areas. Yeah. So if I select the vertexes, if I hit U and Smart UV, there's this island margin section here, and it default is 0, so they're just going to be smushed together. And if I increase this a little bit to like 0.05 is probably fine, then we get the separation between the areas. But that's only if you don't have UVs. If you're using, you know, a model that you found online, it'll probably already have UVs in it. So you'll see a setup like this. So that's the first part of the process, just getting the UVs there. But to actually make the texture, we can go over to Texture Paint. And so this is where we can actually paint directly on the model, and we can make a texture. So if I go to texture slots, if I'm starting from scratch, I need to make a new texture. And you can see there's different types of textures. There's the base color, which is that albedo color. Then there's other textures for things like roughness, metallic, normal maps. And we'll look at a couple examples of that in a little bit. But for now, let's just do the base color. We don't need alpha because we're not going to have any transparency. The default is 1024 by 1024. That's probably fine. I'm just going to hit OK here. And so now what I can do is I can just paint directly on here. So if I choose a color, I can like paint the eyes. And you can see what it's doing. It's actually painting over on here. And I can paint on here as well. I can paint like that, and it's going to fill in this area. Another thing that you could do is just bring this into Photoshop and use Photoshop, because you can do a lot of stuff in Blender, but it's not perfect. You're not going to be able to do everything that you want to do. You can do some basic painting. You can do like a color fill. So if I just want to fill the whole color, I have to choose a different color. I can just fill in the color like that, or I can do a selection and fill. But you can't, it's not as sophisticated as, you know, Photoshop or other things like that. But you can do some painting, and that's basically how textures are made. So that example is really just to show what's happening, but now I want to open up the pigeon and show a slightly more sophisticated texture setup. Any other questions on this part? Okay. There's a ton of stuff in here, so there's a lot to play with. You don't have to, do everything, but it's good to kind of know how everything fits together. Okay, so let's go to a new Blender. I'm gonna hit A and X and delete everything, and I'm gonna import my pigeon. So I'm gonna go to File, Import, and I'm gonna import a GLB. Where's GLB? There it is. Okay. And so I'll grab my pigeon GLB. There we go. So the pigeon already has some materials. The pigeon is actually made up of a few meshes. So there's this like body, there's the eyes, there's the wings and the tail. Let's turn on the material preview so I actually see those colors. And so now you see if I go to UV editing, one of the things that they do is they just have this one texture that has a lot of different colors in it. And instead of like actually filling in, what they do is they basically are just taking all of the points of the mesh, like this one, and squishing them into a tiny spot. And so then whatever color they put it over, it's gonna take that color. So you can see all of the tail is selected. And so if we look in our UV map, we can see part of the tail is this gray and part of the tail is this lighter gray. So let's select, I'm box selecting, so I'm hitting B and then dragging over here. And if I hit G and move that over here, we have to change the model preview. You can see now we've got these like blue feathers. I can hit Tab to leave edit to see what that looks like, and then go back. And so then I can move those down to green. And so this is a clever setup for their textures, where basically instead of actually painting on stuff, they just have a bunch of colors. They took all the UVs from one area and squished them into like into a line basically. And then, you can just put it over whatever color you want for that area. So that's a pretty typical way to set up a basic texture and material setup. If you're just going for some block colors, they're not like shading in between the different areas or anything like that. And that's basically how all of these materials work. So like with our main pigeon, if I hit Tab, you can see there's a lot of geometry here, but it's using the exact same texture. And so if I box grab here, that's like the body texture. So if I want the bird to be green, I can do that. If I want it to be yellow, I can go over here. And so it's just a very simple texture setup. And so if I want that if I make something that I like and I want to put it in Blender, all I have to do is export it. So I'm just gonna export, File, Export, GLB, and just replace that pigeon. And it should just go right there. Resave. Okay, so now I have a yellow pigeon. So that's normally what your textures look like. And you can edit the texture, you could add other textures in here. That's one type of setup. If you look at like super hyper realistic stuff, you're gonna see a lot more complex setup. So let's look at another way that we can work with some textures. But yeah, that's what we would do in Blender. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we wanna. No, I think that's basically it. Okay, so another thing that we saw when we were looking at some of our textures are things like normals and roughness and things like that. You can add texture maps to like pretty much anything, and it affects the way that the light interacts with that thing. So I'll show you guys a couple examples of this, and what I'm gonna do is instead of trying to create this from scratch, I'm just gonna download a material or a texture pack. There's a lot of these on the internet in various places. I'm gonna look for like a grass texture.
On the Makerspace website, I have a list of places where you can get
Oh, really?
or near free CG assets. If you just type in BBC Makerspace, it pops up. It should be under Learn, Resources, and Stock Assets. If you scroll down, there should be CG. So it's this is all stock. So fonts.
Okay, yeah,
video,
it's like tons of stuff.
Yeah, so mock-ups. It's near the bottom, I know for sure. Yeah, here we go.
Okay.
So like here's some places that are free or near free. Of course, I tell everybody, please read the readmes and check their licenses beforehand.
Okay. Okay, let's see. I think CG
I know
Cookie.
CG Cookie's pretty decent. I remember when they used to have a whole bunch of old concept art
Oh,
stuff
really?
from when they were back when they had like free tutorials. They may no longer have free assets because I made that page like 2
Oh,
years
really?
ago. So I'm in the midst of auditing. So.
Okay. Yeah, I think they do. So yeah, if we're in downloads, let's go to materials.
And if you happen to know any sites, let me know. I can add them to the.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Ooh, there's one that says CC0.
Okay.
There's like a tag that was like CC0. I'm like, ooh.
Yeah.
We like that.
Yeah. I don't see textures on here though, so I'm gonna go back. So I'm just gonna use Google for now, but that's a good resource to have. So I am gonna go to the tools. Oh, what? Did they? Oh no, I want to go to images. Whoops. Okay, I want to go to tools and go to Creative Commons, so I know that I'm not stealing stuff that people don't want me to use. And so now we'll see some different textures. And what I really want is a texture pack, so let's do that. Okay. And this looks like a good one. And let's see. Oh, well, that's kind of nice. Maybe it's not showing. Okay, I'm going to try downloading this because I'm not sure if it has. Oh, now I have to log in. Oh, boy. Okay. I guess I can just do a Google real quick. Oh, my God. Okay, I don't want to do this. I feel like this used to be. Oh, here, this is what we want. Although this is another DeviantArt. Okay, let's see if I can find. I feel like this used to be easier. Let's try Open Game Art. That might be a quicker path to this. So let's go to 3D Art, Texture, search for grass. Okay. I don't see any normals in here. Let's just download it and see what's in there. Okay, so those are nice, but I don't see any normals. Okay, let's see what else. Okay. Okay, here we go. Oh, these are for. No, that's not what I want. I feel like this used to be easier. Okay, let's try this again. Let's just do textures, normals. Okay. Good textures. Okay, so this is a good texture pack. I think we can work with this. I have to log in. Everything makes you log in these days. I guess that's good.
We need a Costa passes, they want to have your internet linked to your personal ID. Which is kind of a little scary.
Why won't it let me log in? Jesus Christ. Okay. Let's go back.
If you're looking for something that you can download without logging in, that's just like a image, you could try Unsplash.
Let's try what?
Unsplash?
Unsplash.
Their stock image. I don't know if you need some like repeated pattern texture. Okay, so nothing free is coming up. Sorry, I just figured that one is free, and you don't need to make an account to download images off of.
Yeah.
It used to be a place that had like just pattern, like infinite patterns for free on the online, but not anymore.
Oh, here we go. Okay, this seems good. Okay, I think we can use this. Sorry about the delay. Okay, so now we've got, okay, this is good. Okay, so we've got some grass, and then we've got some normals. And so we can see how this works a little bit. Okay, so I'm gonna just grab this and put it in my project. I'm gonna make a new folder. Oh, I already have a textures folder. So I'm gonna throw this into my textures folder. Okay. So now let's go back to Godot for a second, and I'm gonna take my ground, and let's say I want this to be grass. I'm gonna make a new material. So I'm gonna go to my mesh, and let's move over here a little bit. And I'm going to reset this and make a new standard material. And so now let's go to the albedo, and I'm gonna add in my grass that I just downloaded right there. Okay, so we see some grass. It doesn't look really good, so this is a good chance to go over a couple things. So once we add that material in, we need to make it map to the actual geometry. We want to go down here to UV1 and turn triplanar on. Okay, so that's gonna map to the actual geometry that we see, and then we can scale it a little bit. So, you know, if you just have the texture very small, you're gonna start to see this kind of repeated pattern. You probably remember seeing games in like the 90s and 2000s where that was quite common. But if we scale this, we can make it a little bit larger. So I'm scaling it down, but I don't want to scale it down too far. So that seems pretty good. It's a little bit, you know, more than what we would probably realistically want, but I do want to be able to see the detail for this demonstration. Okay, so that's our basic texture. So we can see when we look at this, it's a realistic texture, but it's very flat looking because it's just flat on this surface. So a couple things that we can do to affect that. One is our normal map. Normal refers to like the direction that a mesh is pointing, and we can use a normal map to basically imitate more geometry on something that's just a texture. So if I turn this on, and then I grab this grass normal here, I can throw this in here, and it's kind of subtle, but let's just turn it on and off. You can see it we see a little bit more depth there. And so it's basically it's reacting to the lighting and adding shadow. So if I go to this directional light that I added a long time ago, let's stay zoomed in on the grass, but when I go to the light, I'm gonna go to this transform, and I'll just rotate it, and you'll see that it's affecting the shadows in the grass. So the normal map is basically just saying what is higher or lower in this texture. And the way it does that is just with a simple color. So you can see this looks like kind of this weird like vaporwave color thing, but basically what it's using is color data to map to a different value. So the different colors represent different depth values. The darker it is, the sort of lower it's going to be. The brighter it is, the higher it's going to be. And so we can kind of exaggerate this. You don't really want to, I'm going to exaggerate this a little bit just for the demo. You don't necessarily want to do that because it's not going to look super realistic. But if I change the scale here, you're going to kind of see, you know, if I have it low, it stays flat. But if I increase the scale, you know, you can see that those shadows are even more intense. And then if I go back to my directional light and rotate again, you can start to see an exaggerated version of what's happening with our normal map. Okay, so let's reset that for a second. Go back here. I'm going to reset the scale. So that looks kind of nice. You can add a lot of detail there. And then we can add other textures. So this also has, this is a height map actually, but I'm just going to throw this in here just to use an example. So a roughness map, things that are rough are the light is going to be diffuse more. Things that are not rough, the light is going to reflect more. So if I turn on, this is going to look kind of ridiculous because this is grass. But if I go to my roughness, if I turn on the metallic a lot and turn up the specular, we'll see these highlights better. And so now when we're looking in here, you can see that some parts are very reflective and some parts are not. And if we have a good roughness map, this will, you know, map relatively to things that are rough versus things that are not. And so that could be really useful if you have like some detailed geometry that has some parts that are metal and some parts that are like, you know, a softer substance like rubber or something like that. Again, we don't necessarily want to get into this much detail, but this is just an example. This doesn't matter because it's black and white. So that's a roughness. We can also do an emission map. So if we go to emission, if I throw this into the emission map and turn on a color, I need to actually put this texture in here. And so let's do a color. Let's bring this down a little bit. So you can see, it's not really. Oh, I didn't actually get it in there. Why didn't that stay in there? Okay, there we go. So if I throw this in here, now you can see I can make some parts but not everything glow. So you can do that with textures that you get from, you know, wherever. You can download from online, but you can also do that with these textures. So if we wanted to do something really crazy, let's go back over here. I could go, I have this like emission, I could go in here. I could reset these. I could add in a noise texture here. So I have a noise texture on top of a noise texture. Add in some noise. Add in a nice gradient. Something like that. Now I can get some like really crazy sort of multiple textures. And then I can do some emission stuff. So I can go like that. Let's bring it down a little bit here. So yeah, you can get like layers and layers of crazy stuff. Again, this isn't necessarily going to be super realistic, but if you apply these things in more tasteful, subtle ways, you can get some cool effects. But most of the time, you probably just need a couple basic textures and basic materials. All right, I think I've covered enough here. There's obviously a lot more stuff to cover, but you can start to add in some cool effects and do different things with those properties. All right, any questions on textures or materials?
It's all recorded, right?
Yeah. There's also a million like tutorials on this stuff on YouTube and stuff. If you have like specific things that you're interested in, you can find those. All right, I'm gonna stop.